So today's topic is fire ecology, and we have with us the chief of fire crew and the manager of the bison herd, Dr. Towne. Feel free to ask him lots of questions about plants.
And are you get tested on it?
Sweet. They will be tested on it. So,
I guarantee you, you haven't ever heard any of this stuff before. So,
I don't think he's kidding.
no, I'm not. This is brand new stuff. Once we get going. So we're going to start this at settlement. The bison had already been moved out of the area. The settlers were just coming in, setting up their homesteads, a little bit of plowed land, but there basically wasn't anything eating the grass. Grass was growing like crazy. And fires were a dangerous situation because there was no way to control them. They were burning for miles and miles and miles. So the settlers grew up here with a basic fear of fire. It was a dangerous thing. As the settlement progressed, we had more and more cattle moving into the area, and by the 1880s, they was bringing up transient steers for summer grazing into the Flint Hills, and burning became a very routine practice because the ranchers knew that if they burned the area, the cattle would gain more weight than if they didn't burn the area. So burning was very, very common. But the same thing that occurred 150 years ago occurs now. And the people in the city were griping about the smoke. that the ranchers would burn, the people in the city would say, they don't need to burn, I don't like the smell of the smoke. So it was the same issue as what's currently going on today. About the turn of the century, there were some big major droughts and some devastating forest fires in other regions. And so it just more or less solidified this concept that fire is bad and it's dangerous. And the accommodations that we had here at the time basically didn't have any background into grassland burning. All they knew about was a forest fire burning, and forest fires were considered bad and dangerous and undesirable. So there was a widespread effort after the turn of the century to suppress fires. Just say, you don't need them, don't want them, but nobody knew anything about it. So we, at K-State, was Agricultural College then, set up the first study to actually look at the effects of fire. This is set up in 1918. He did a 4-year study. He had one plot that he burned in March, and he had one plot that he didn't burn right next to it. He mowed and raked this plot at the end of the season. And he collected biomass off the 2 plots, and he looked at plant species composition. And after 4 years, his basic conclusion reflects the bias that they had at the time. And the bias is that we expect fire to be bad. Dang it, couldn't prove it. But we found nothing wrong with burning the pasture. A few years later, a guy named Aldous came in and said, by gum, I can prove it. So he set up a series of plots. He had 5 plots on this side, 5 plots on this side. We'll ignore these. These were burned annually at 5 different times. These were burned every 2 years. These were never used in any reports or publications. So the only ones that was ever used was the single replications on Upland Prairie. This is just north of campus. There's a building sitting on top of these plots right now. Meadow Rock Hills is right over here. But he set out to look at burning effects on different times of the year, and he compared it with an unburned plot. The unburned plot they mowed and raked off every year. We quit doing that. I say we. I wasn't around then. But they quit doing that in 1968. I took this picture in 1982, and so these are 14 years of growth in the 2 unburned plots. These plots are 66 by 33 foot, upland prairie. So, and the one point I want to call attention to is late spring growth was considered a product maggot at the time. So Aldous published in 1934 6 years of data And on it, he concluded that burning at any time dramatically reduces total biomass production. Total biomass production was they would run a sickle ball mower through the middle of the plot, break it up, let it air dry, and then weigh it. That was how they determined biomass production. So it was a combination of everything. And unburned plots, now keep in mind, these were mowed and raked every year, so all the dead stuff was removed off. But there was at least a 30% reduction in biomass production by burning. So this is the first major study on burning anywhere, tallgrass burning. And this right here is the foundation for the entire burning philosophy that followed for the Flint Hills for the next 30 years. This study says if you burn, you're going to have a reduction in biomass production. So for the next 30 years, the official policy coming out of K-State was do not burn. Extension agents would go out and tell people do not burn. And that's the sole research that was done. There's a couple of studies done on these plots in the late 50s looking at soil moistures, but the sole foundation was based upon this one study. And then in the early 60s, Anderson's grad student decided to reevaluate the data and look at it for a longer period of time. And this is, remember, this is still a single replication of the animal husbandry plots. And the unmowed was still mowed and raked. The unmowed was still mowed and raked. And in this publication, it was only 2.5 pages. He never once mentioned that the unburned was mowed and raked. He just said unburned pasture. And on here they found that burning at any time reduced grass production significantly compared to unburned, but the reduction was only 10% from late spring burning. So you didn't lose near as much as what Aldous had first initially discovered, and that there was a 13% reduction between burning early and late. And remember that because we'll come back to that later on. That won't be on the test. Maybe not. But this is the first study to use statistics to try and verify that there was indeed a difference between burn treatments. Now, since there was only one replication, he couldn't really use legitimate statistics. He had to use pseudo-statistics and using years as a replication. To use years as a replication, you've got to assume that there's no interaction between burn treatment and yield. That means that the plot responds the same every year, no matter whether it's a wet yield, dry yield, or what. So by assuming that there's no interaction, they was able to run statistics on yield, and so that's why it says these are significantly lower than the unburned. So anyway, after this one came out in the early 60s, they began moderating a little bit on the stance against anti-burning, and that they said, okay, we don't think you ought to burn, but if you do burn, do it in late April. Do it as late as possible, and that way you cause the least amount of damage, because it was still viewed that fire causes damage. So it was this whole concept that burning late causes less damage than burning early on. So this is the second study that helped form the foundation of the burn policy for Kansas. The third study came out in the mid-60s, and this was a pasture study. One pasture burned in early spring, mid-spring, one pasture burned in late spring, and an unburned pasture grazed by steers season long. And they had cages out in the middle of the grain sites, and at the end of the season they would clip the cages and just throw everything into a bag, and the forage was considered what they thought the animals would eat. And the weeds were considered what they thought the animals would eat. Very subjective. But anyway, on it, they ran this study for 8 years. Actually, the study started in 1950, ran through 1966. They threw out the first 8 years of study and threw out the last year of the study because it conforms with the whole concept of what ought to happen a little bit better. But You got to remember, the bias is still there. It's been taught for 30 years that burning is bad. So that there's an inherent bias in all these studies, at least up until the ones we did. No, I mean, we'll look at that later. And so once again, they did not have replications, and so they had to use the 8 years of the study as a replication. And on it, it said the unburned pasture had the highest biomass. But it wasn't significantly different from late spring burning, but it was significantly higher than burning in early or in mid-spring. So from that one, they then concluded, it says, okay, it's okay to burn in late spring. It's not as bad because we didn't find any significant difference. And keep in mind here that total biomass production was the sole criterion that they was using on whether it was good or not so good to burn at different times of the year. So they started moderating and saying, okay, it's not as bad to burn. In fact, if you're going to do it, go ahead and do it in late April. Burning it any other time, not so good. By the mid-60s, though, after preaching for 30 years, do not burn. For 30 years, they were telling people, do not burn. And all of a sudden, they looked out of the window and they saw that explosion of cedar trees. Because there were some ranchers who believed it. There were some ranchers who chased them off the land and said, get out of here, you idiots. But there was a lot of people who believed it. This is K-State, the smartest people in the state. And so with the explosion of cedar trees, then K-State began to moderate the position even more, and they acknowledged that burning was an integral part of prairie management. You needed to do it or you were going to lose your prairie to cedar trees. So then the policy became, in the late 60s, say, okay, you need to burn in order to maintain tall grass prairie. You've got to do it. But the only time you can do it is late April. Burning at any other time is bad, and that was based solely upon the other two studies from the August plots on the upland prairie. So from the 1960s, late 60s on, it became commonly practiced to burn in late April. And it became ingrained. Everybody began doing it. It was part of the culture. You burn in late April. That's just the way you do it. No logical reason behind it. Everything was based upon these two other studies that said if you burn early, you're going to lower your biomass production. So after 30 years of telling people not to burn, and then they switched to say, okay, you got to burn, but the only time you can burn is late April. And that even got so absurd at some point, people were telling the only time you can burn is April 28th at 10 a.m. in the morning. You burn it any other time, you're going to lose biomass. And we'll use some other. So, well, we question that whether an entire policy on burning for the Flint Hills ought to be based upon small plots and unreplicated studies. Everything was totally unreplicated. They didn't have any idea of how much variation there was in any of the burn treatments. They just looked at it and said, well, this is higher, therefore it's better. Well, this is lower, therefore it's worse. So in 1994, we set up a replicated study in our watersheds out here to look at the effects of burning in the fall, winter, and spring. And these are the average dates for when we did the burning. We're now in the 19th. We just finished the 19th year. We're ready for the 20th year. We looked at sites on both uplands and lowland sites. We sampled the heck out of them. On both of those, we took biomass production, plant species composition, and permanent plots. And we also did flowering stem production of the major grasses.